Sasori vs Kisame may sound like a fight that's not remotely close, since the Puppet Master lost to Sakura and Chiyo during the very first arc of Shippuden. While Kisame was not only one of the longest surviving members of the Akatsuki, but also went on to fight some of Konoha's strongest shinobi during the war arc. After all, shonen manga in general tend to have pretty extreme power cliffing as they go on, so it makes perfect sense for this battle to be a complete stomp in Kisame's favor, right? Well, in this video, I'm going to be explaining why a fight between Sasori and Kisame would actually be extremely close, because in Naruto specifically, a lot of fights are very matchup dependent, and the power increase of the war arc isn't nearly as detrimental to Sasori as you might think. Starting off, I think it's best to begin with how strong Sasori is, since most of his scaling is just based on his basic lore, as well as his fights with Sakura and Chiyo. People are extremely quick to dismiss Sasori because of his loss against them, but personally, I am of the opinion that this fight can't really be used to significantly discredit Sasori, although not for the reason typically given. Fans of Sasori will say that he was holding back nearly the entire time due to Chiyo wielding the puppets that were based on his parents, but in reality, this probably didn't affect the way he fought, except for the finishing blow. Even after Chiyo brings out the puppets of his parents, Sasori himself says that he's trying to end the fight soon and was seemingly frustrated at how long it was dragging out, implying that he's clearly trying to win. And to further support this, Chiyo herself says that the reason why her and Sakura should have lost is because Sasori dropped his guard for a single moment at the end of the battle, which I think is particularly telling because it wouldn't really make sense for Chiyo to solely credit her win to the final moment without mentioning anything else if Sasori was also holding back for the entire fight. That being said, Sakura doesn't really scale to Sasori's higher end puppets in terms of speed regardless, because she was being controlled by Chiyo throughout almost the entirety of the battle. While it is true that later on in the fight, Sakura was capable of combating Sasori's third Kazekage puppet without Chiyo's help, the issue with this is that Sakura was predicting where the puppet would go based on Sasori's hand movements, giving her a form of pseudo-precognition on what the puppet would do next. Even though this does show that Sasori's own movement speed isn't faster than Sakura's reactions, that isn't the case for the third Kazekage puppet itself because Sakura wasn't directly reacting to its attacks. This distinction may seem pointless, but it is actually very important to make because if Sasori wants to, he can control his puppets directly from his core, with Data Book 3 stating that there's no time lag between his will and the movements of the puppets as they are directly hooked up to his nucleus. So, when Sasori controls his puppets directly with his core, which he should be capable of doing with the third Kazekage as well if he goes all out from the start, then the strategy that Sakura used wouldn't work because there'd be no hand movements to track. This means that rather than Sasori's own physical speed, what's much more important is the speed of the puppets themselves. And this is why his biggest asset in most fights is the third Kazekage puppet, since it should fully scale to the real third Kazekage in his prime. This is because it's made from the corpse of the real third Kazekage. And Sasori states that in addition to keeping the third's Kekkei Genkai, the puppet also possesses the original chakra the Kazekage had while he was alive, which means that in terms of raw power, they should be equal. Of course, you can still argue that Sasori is on the level of the third Kazekage, even without the puppet, since he was the one to assassinate the Kazekage on his own, which the third data book called a hard-fought battle, implying that it wasn't just a sneak attack. But given that Sasori's main way of fighting is through poison, and the entire thing happened off-screen, it is still a little bit contentious. My main point is just that even if you don't think that Sasori's stronger than the third Kazekage on his own, he should at least be capable of reaching that level when he uses his core to control the third Kazekage puppet without any of the delay caused by hand movements. This is a really big deal because in both the manga and data books, the third is hyped up to be the strongest of all the Kazekage, which includes Rasa, Gaara's father, who could fight evenly with him during the war arc. Obviously, Gaara did end up winning this fight in the end, but it is worth pointing out that he only gained the advantage by forcing Rasa to clash with the sand in his gourd, and then using the desert sand at Rasa's feet to seal him, which is something that Gaara wouldn't be able to do under most circumstances where there isn't a literal desert that he has complete control over. And prior to Gaara taking advantage of the territory, the fight between him and Rasa was completely even, with the 4th data book describing it as fierce. So I do think that without the terrain advantage, they should be roughly equal to each other. This means that the 3rd Kazekage puppet should rival Gaara at the very least by virtue of scaling over Rasa, which is extremely impressive because during the 5 Kage summit, Gaara could block attacks from Sasuke's Inferno style and the Raikage. Due to this, when Sasori pulls out the 3rd Kazekage puppet and actually links it to his core, he should be able to contend with the 5 Kage individually, especially since the iron sand of his Kazekage puppet is also coated in poison, meaning even touching it briefly could prove to be fatal. Plus, on top of the 3rd Kazekage, Sasori also has access to an army of 100 puppets, which are a massive force to be reckoned with, because if even one of them manages to get a scratch in with his poison, it's game over. Sasori says that he took down an entire nation with this puppet army, which is confirmed in the 3rd data book, but it's difficult to know how impressive this feat really is, since we know that there are nations in the Naruto world without any shinobi, which means that Sasori could have just used his puppet army to destroy a ton of relatively weak normal people. The only way to potentially try and scale this feat in the manga is to argue that Hiruzen says that Orochimaru could overthrow a small nation by himself when describing how big a threat he is to the village elders, which could potentially suggest that overthrowing a nation is a Sannin level feat. But this is just really vague, since we have no idea what countries in particular Hiruzen is referencing, and how they would stack up to the ones Sasori destroyed. Regardless, I would still argue that the 100 puppet army is still a massive threat, especially in the context of a one-on-one fight, since it's incredibly difficult to fight 100 opponents at once without getting hit a single time. And what's arguably harder to deal with is Sasori himself, since he turned his own body into a supreme puppet. Sasori's puppet body is referred to as the Supreme Puppet in Data Book 3, not because of its stats, which we see are quite lackluster, but due to the fact that it's completely indestructible. Sasori's body parts immediately separate upon being hit to mitigate the force of attacks, and Sasori can easily reattach them back together, practically making him immune to blunt force attacks. But Sasori's puppet body does have one major weakness, because the core that contains all of his chakra is exposed and can be destroyed in one blow, which means that if his opponent can figure out his weak spot, Sasori is just as mortal as everyone else. Moving on, when scaling Kisame, a lot of people immediately try to use his fight with B, but I take issue with this because he does just absorb multiple Biju cloaks off of B throughout the battle, making it impossible to determine to what extent Kisame's feats in this fight are due to his own power rather than the boost given by the 8 Tails chakra. In the middle of the fight, Kisame also just states that the stronger his opponent is, the stronger he becomes as well, further implying that Kisame was significantly powered up during his fight with B. Because of this, I think a much more consistent avenue to scale Kisame is by looking at his encounter with the Konoha Shinobi on Turtle Island. To be fair, even in this instance, Kisame did absorb some chakra from B and Aoba using Samehada, but considering that Kisame himself also just has massive reserves that are even beyond Naruto's, I think it's fair to say that whatever chakra he absorbed probably didn't make too much of a difference here, since it's not like the other fight where Kisame was just eating Biju cloaks for breakfast. The only other thing worth noting is that fighting on an island surrounded by water does give Kisame an edge as a water style user, but despite this being true, we do see that a clone of Kisame with only 30% of his chakra is capable of casually flooding an entire battlefield in his fight against Team Guy earlier in the series, which is also pointed out in the third databook. This means that Kisame can just recreate the territory advantage he had on Turtle Island by filling the landscape with water even if the surroundings are bone dry to start. So he should be capable of replicating all the feats he displayed during the war arc. And Kisame's showings on Turtle Island were pretty crazy as well, since he was capable of fighting on par with 6th Gate Guy despite not even having Samehada on hand. After Kisame clashes evenly with the Isaku Jaku, Guy says that it can't be helped and resorts to opening the 7th gate to fire the Hirudora, which is his strongest attack outside of the Gate of Death. Upon seeing this massive tiger flying at him, Kisame obviously assumes it's an attack made of chakra and decides to counter with the Super Water Shark Bomb, which gets stronger by absorbing ninjutsu, only realizing that the Hirudora was a physical shockwave far too late. Of course, since the Shark Bomb had no chakra to absorb, it got immediately overpowered. Yet Kisame still somehow manages to survive a direct hit from a Hirudora way bigger than the one that sent Madara Susanoo flying later on in the war. Kisame was very clearly injured from the attack, and it completely ended the battle, so I'm not claiming that he's stronger than Madara Susanoo, but the fact that it didn't blow him to smithereens is still ridiculous. And remember, Kisame did all this without being fused with Samehada, which should boost his power by a massive amount, given that it's what earned him his reputation as the tailless tailed beast. Believe it or not, Kisame's best showing actually happens right after his encounter with Guy, since he was able to break out of Yamato's wood style with pure physical strength, despite it specifically being used to suppress Kisame's chakra. This is extremely impressive, as in the Battle of Tenchi Bridge, Yamato was able to capture Four Tails Naruto using his wood style. And even when Naruto started to break out, he took a decent amount of time snapping the restraints one by one, as opposed to Kisame, who destroyed his restraints immediately when he began resisting. Being stronger than a Four Tails Naruto is great for Kisame, because this version of Naruto was able to put massive pressure on Jiraiya when the QB rampaged and managed to nearly kill him. Admittedly, Jiraiya was only trying to retighten Minato's seal, and did it successfully, implying that he's above Four Tails Naruto without lethal intent, albeit still with extreme difficulty given his major injuries from the encounter. But on the other hand, it's equally fair to point out that Kisame was just hit by a Hirudora and then a direct punch from Guy right before Yamato suppressed him, which means that if anything, Kisame was even more blatantly weakened than Jiraiya. So both base Jiraiya and Kisame have very similar showings of being above Four Tails Naruto while nerfed, which, given how much Jiraiya struggled, does support the idea that at the very least, when Kisame's at full power and fused with Samehada, he should be capable of rivaling the base Sani. Now that I've gone over both Sasori and Kisame's strength, we can finally talk about how a fight between them would play out, right after you hit the subscribe button if you want to see more Naruto content. Discussing fights with Sasori tends to be really weird, because it's essentially a matter of if he's capable of landing a single scratch with his poison. Sakura and Chiyo managed to get around this since Sakura made antidotes out of the poison extracted from Kankuro, but unless you just so happen to have a medical genius tutored by Tsunade, a poison sample, and time to prepare it in advance, there's no getting around the fact that Sasori can kill you by landing a single attack. Because of this, a lot of the fight rests on whether or not Kisame actually has knowledge of Sasori's poison, since Kisame has been hit in every fight he's ever had, even when facing off against vastly inferior opponents. So if Kisame isn't aware that all of Sasori's attacks are poison coated, then he's probably going to fight recklessly and end up losing to poison. However, I do think it's fine to say that Kisame might have knowledge of Sasori's poisons, because not only are they on the Akatsuki together, but Sasori also earned a reputation as Sasori of the Red Sand for his accomplishments on the battlefield, which involved using poison-rigged puppets that were later handled by Kankuro. Sasori also implies that this reputation is more so known among senior shinobi rather than teenagers who are Kankuro's age, which just raises the odds that Kisame, who's in his early 30s, would know the basics about Sasori's fighting style. So even though there isn't any concrete evidence that Kisame is aware of Sasori's poison, it is a very real possibility that I will be assuming for the sake of making the video more interesting. Getting into the matchup itself, Sasori will almost assuredly start out inside the Hiroko puppet as he normally has it on at all times, which we know since even Zetsu had no idea what Sasori looked like without it. And this initial puppet shouldn't pose much trouble at all for Kisame because Sakura and Chio literally took it out in 6 pages. Sasori fired poison-coated needles at the duo from Hiroko's mouth and then launched a rigged trap that sent even more needles in every direction. But Chio controlled Sakura to evade both attacks and destroy the puppet in one punch. Even though Kisame may not have the finesse to dodge the needles in the same way, he can still deflect them with large-scale water style that shields him from all directions. And after that, there's nothing stopping him from hitting Hiroko in the same way that Sakura did. I know it might sound like I'm being a bit too dismissive of Hiroko here, but realistically, when the puppet's best feat is beating Kankuro of all people in a fight, there's not much you can really do for it. But this couldn't be further from the truth for the third Kazekage puppet, because it's legitimately strong enough to give Kisame a run for his money. As I said earlier, in terms of pure power, the Iron Sand should generally be stronger than both Gaara's defense and attacks from the 4th Raikage, which is a big deal because Kisame's higher end scaling is to the base Sannin, who are only on par with the 5 Kage. So, if the 3rd Kazekage puppet is generally stronger than the 5 Kage, but Kisame can only roughly be placed around the level of the base Sannin, then it does support the idea that Kisame may not have enough raw power to break through Sasori's Iron Sand. Another possible method Kisame has to get around the 3rd Kazekage puppet is by absorbing the Iron Sand directly. But the issue with this is that the Iron Sand itself is real, meaning it can't be absorbed like regular ninjutsu. A counter argument to this may be that Gaara's sand fell from Madara's hand when he used the Rinnegan to absorb Naruto's Rasen Shuriken, which could imply that even though the sand itself isn't absorbable, maybe Kisame could absorb the chakra inside it to make Sasori lose control. This explanation definitely isn't airtight though, because Gaara's whole point of grabbing Madara's arm was to drag him into the Rasen Shuriken, so he could have simply stopped manipulating the sand once Naruto's jutsu seemingly made contact. Personally, I think Gaara did stop his sand of his own volition rather than Madara absorbing it, because later on, during the 5 Kage's final combo attack against Madara, Gaara's sand stuck to him even while he was using the Rinnegan to absorb the ninjutsu of the other Kage. Obviously, since Gaara's sand didn't fall apart, even while Madara was clearly using the Preta Path, then it means that the chakra inside it simply can't be absorbed. So Samehada likely wouldn't be able to take chakra out of the Iron Sand either. This doesn't mean that Samehada is completely useless though, because Kisame was able to absorb Aoba's chakra through kunai connected with chakra wire that should be very similar to the chakra strings used by puppeteers. So Kisame should be able to directly absorb Sasori's chakra through his puppets, but this would require tagging either the puppet or threads directly, which is pretty difficult because Sasori can use the unabsorbable iron sand to guard the Kazekage puppet himself and the chakra strings to prevent them from being absorbed or cut. This means that Kisame's only way to destroy the Kazekage puppet is by maneuvering around the iron sand to try and land a direct hit, which is going to be pretty risky since the iron sand's offense is actually implied to be even tougher than its defense. To be clear, I'm not talking about the mini pellets of iron that Chiyo was capable of blocking, but rather the large geometric blocks which she could only afford to dodge. These attacks made of iron sand are probably stronger than its defense because it's stated in the third databook that the compressed iron sand the third Kazekage puppet uses for offense is even denser than the material it was originally made of, suggesting that the strongest attacks the puppet has are tougher than its defense. And we also see this is the case in the manga itself, because Sasori is shown to cut through his own iron sand, making the databook statement very consistent. This makes it very difficult to argue that Kisame would be able to block Sasori's iron sand attacks, which is really bad, since if the sand makes contact with him, it's genuinely game over due to the lethal poison it's coated in. Kisame does have a decent countermeasure for this though, because if he floods the battle with water style like he's done previously, then he can maneuver around super fast using a smaller water shark bomb, making it extremely difficult for the third Kaze puppet to tag him. But even in this scenario, Sasori does have one trump card up his sleeve that's almost impossible to dodge, which is Iron Sand World Order. This attack extends iron sand in all directions with a massive range that even smashes through the environment, making it practically impossible to dodge, as shown by the fact that Sakura got tagged nearly a dozen times, despite the fact that she specifically trained with Tsunade to never take a hit since the medic should never go down first. Even if Kisame somehow manages to dodge the attack, the databook also notes that in the scenario that Iron Sand World Order misses, it still makes it extremely hard for the opponent to maneuver around the battlefield, which makes sense just by looking at the ridiculous number of iron needles. And this would give Sasori the ability to potentially catch Kisame in the third Kazekage puppet's Poison Cloud. The only counter to this that's realistic for Kisame is if he uses Earth-style Underground Swim, which would let him avoid the Poison Cloud or whatever follow-up Sasori tries if he survives the initial World Order attack. But it won't help against the main technique, as that's just shown to pierce the ground and went through a boulder to hit Sakura, whereas Kisame is barely below the surface when using Underground Swim. So I do think that if Kisame manages to dodge the initial attack, he does have the ability to survive in the aftermath if he plays his cards right, but Iron Sand World Order is just really hard to evade in the first place, which is why it's a very solid win condition for Sasori. But Kisame can deal with Sasori a lot better if he fuses with Samehara and more importantly activates the Water Shark Dome, his largest scale water style ninjutsu, which is used to trap the opponent before Sasori starts to really pressure him with the third Kazekage puppet. And I do think that there's at least a decent chance that Kisame would immediately start to pull out his higher end techniques in character once the Kazekage puppet is revealed. Given that according to the third data book, at one point in time, the third Kazekage was literally called the strongest shinobi, so Kisame should know not to mess around. Sasori would be able to handle the Water Shark Dome a bit better than the average shinobi though, since he does have one benefit that the others don't, which is a lack of organs including lungs, meaning he can't drown from a lack of oxygen. However, there is still the issue that we've never seen puppets be used underwater before, and even if Sasori can do it with some level of competency, they would still likely be slower inside the dome, as opposed to Kisame who gets faster according to the fourth databook. This would make it easier for Kisame to maneuver around the iron sand, and the chances of him actually managing to land a hit on the third Kazekage goes up by a lot, which would practically guarantee him the win. I am mostly leaving Sasori's 100 puppet army out of the conversation, but that's because we just see Sakura cleanly react to them even while they're being controlled directly by Sasori's core. So in terms of speed, Kisame should be far above the army. Combine this with the fact that he can summon 1,000 sharks on command that would literally outnumber the puppets 10 to 1, on top of Kisame's own massive water style within the dome, and the army is just completely cooked. Sasori's only chance of surviving in this situation is to try and get out of the water shark dome, but he probably wouldn't be able to because it's so big that B literally couldn't see the end of it. To be fair, the dome would likely be smaller without the 8 tails chakra that Kisame absorbed, but the main issue is that the entire dome actively moves with Kisame, which means that regardless of its size, Sasori would only be able to escape if he can move faster underwater than Kisame, which just isn't happening. This leaves a single question left, which is if Kisame would know to destroy Sasori's puppet core, even if he has the advantage. And I will say that when fused with Samehada, Kisame should be able to figure that out extremely quick, since it allows him to sense chakra through his skin, so Kisame should know that all of Sasori's chakra is located in his core, and from there it doesn't take a genius to determine that's what needs to be destroyed. To wrap things up, I think Sasori has a very solid opening to win if he pulls out the third Kazekage puppet early and uses his larger scale attacks like Iron Sand World Order before Kisame fuses with Samehada. After all, the odds that Kisame can come out of an attack like that without a single scratch are extremely thin. But if the fight gets to the point where Kisame actually forms the water shark dome and fuses with Samehada, he almost assuredly would be capable of beating down Sasori without too much trouble. Honestly, in my opinion, the fight mostly depends on if Sasori activates Iron Sand World Order or Kisame uses the Water Shark Dome first, because neither of them really have a very consistent counter to each other's trump cards. And despite the fight being very close, I think Kisame would win 6 times out of 10, since he at least has a small chance at surviving Iron Sand World Order by trying to evade it. Whereas if the Water Shark Dome comes out, it's pretty much a guaranteed victory for Kisame. Thanks for watching. If you want to watch another video by me, make sure to check out this one where I talk about Sakura vs. Lee. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Later!